Now then, BCO, organisers of today's webinar. I'm proud to say that I'm one of the founder members of the BCO, and I was at the first meeting held to discuss setting up the organisation back in late 1989. It was formed in 1990, and there were 14 of us around the table, mostly from the development lobby, but I was the sole planner present. And I must say I was touched by the generosity of everybody else in the room when they were allocating the membership numbers to the founding members, that they very kindly made me member number 14. Anyway, I've stuck it out and I'm very pleased to still be active in the BCO. I find it's an excellent organisation for exchanging information. Hopefully today will be no exception to that. And we have a webinar session on the future of the high street in the 21st century to get our teeth into. I'm joined by a panel to discuss the topic. We have an economic strategist in the form of Paul Swinney from the Centre for Cities. We have a development strategist in the form of Roger Dring from Lend Lease, speaking to us direct from Sydney in Australia, where I'm told that the temperatures have dropped slightly from the 42 degrees they had only a few days ago. Well, never mind, we've got 5 degrees here, we'll make the best of them. And third, last but not least, we have Josef Cannon, a barrister, because when you have a Welshman chairing any panel, it is compulsory to have a barrister present. Before we kick off the topic, I'd also like to extend my thanks to, especially to Camelia Huygens, who's doing all the tech from behind the scenes here and is making sure that we all connect at the right times. And she's also been instrumental in putting this all together from the technological front. I'm very grateful to Camelia. And she's being helped by Bryony George this morning. Ariz's side, who's head of research at BCO, has also been very heavily involved in planning this event, as indeed have the planning committee that have put it together. And Cristiano Testi is the chairman of the BCO Urban Group that has led the product that you're getting today. So the death, or the currently announced death of the high street. I remember over 5 years ago now, visiting Glasgow, and I hadn't been there for some years. And normally when I go to a city I haven't been to for some time, I do what I call, as a planner, taking a transect. I start in the centre and I walk in a straight line out of the place, just to gauge its economic health and see how well it's doing, to get a feel of the place. And I'll never forget setting off down Sauchiehall Street in a westerly direction. And before I'd gone 100 yards, I came across my very first example of a pound shop closing down. And it was at that point that I realized that the trend I'd been seeing of high streets switching over to pound shops and charity shops was actually sliding further out of control, and that even the pound shops couldn't make a go of it. Well, since those days, 5 years ago, we've seen high streets up and down the country, even high streets in relatively prosperous parts of big cities and in city centres themselves suffering with a gap tooth appearance from small independent retailers going out of business, followed then by department stores. We've had news only this week of Topshop and the demise of Topshop and Debenhams. And indeed, as somebody was saying to me, you know, there's another very big hole in the centre of Manchester going to be left by a block which contains Debenhams and House of Fraser. So our big city centres are suffering very badly at the moment. Now, when we planned this event, we thought it would be very sensible to look at the future of the high street, not purely from a retail perspective, because it's quite likely that the future of the high street isn't a retail future. It may contain retail, but retail may be an adjunct to other things that give vibrancy to the centres of our communities. And these centres and retaining their vibrancy is extremely important for the health of places. It isn't just the economics of the high street and retailers and developers we have to worry about. It is the very health of communities if they lose their focus. Now, I don't want to take too much of the thunder from our three excellent panelists, who are all going to give their introductions and their take on the current situation. So without more ado, I'm going to introduce the first of our panelists this morning and seek his thoughts. And the first person that's going to talk to us is Paul Swinney. Paul is Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. He oversees the research programme and strategy of the Centre. He's published on a wide range of subjects relating to city economics, including the development of UK cities over time, the role that city centres play in the national economy, and the trading relationships UK cities have with the rest of the world. He's a regular regional and national media commentator, including print, radio and TV, and speaks at conferences across the UK on subjects relating to the performance of city economies. He is, by the way, the author of the Macam Dictionary, and I'm sure you're all aware of this learned tome. He assures me that it is in fact the #1 best-selling book at Waterstones in Sunderland, where it outstrips the Harry Potter novels. Anyway, well, there we are. You can see a rounded strategist keen to share with us some of his thoughts on the 21st century high street. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Pete. That's best-selling book of all time for that particular outlet of Waterstones. Just to be crystal clear about that. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction. So my name is Paul Swinney, as Peter said. Centre for Cities, who are we? We're a think tank that looks at the 63 largest city economies in the UK, ranging from Exeter being the smallest through to places like Cambridge, Wakefield, Barnsley, up to obviously London being the largest. And there are a number of people on the call today who work for organisations that we've worked with through our 16 years of being, and very happy to do that again in the future. I've got 3 points that I'd like to make about the high street. The first is that despite ongoing stories about the death of the high street isn't dying everywhere. And I think that sort of perpetuates a little bit, because when you have a big store that goes under, like say Maplin's or Toys R Us, or more recently Debenhams, that's very visual, and sort of the media sort of presents that story, and then the sort of link is that shop is failed, or that chain has failed, therefore the high street is dying. I think there are sort of 2 things with that. First is, don't necessarily mistake the struggles of one particular business to represent the broader high street, like Debenhams, for example, which has been struggling for some time. Then the second point within that is that if you then look across the country, what we see is that, yes, in some places, high streets are dying. If you went to, say, the centre of Barnsley, for example, or the centre of Doncaster, you would see that you've got a central core there that is clearly not very vibrant. But if you go to a number of other places, centre of London in particular, which is obviously pre-COVID, but centre of London, centre of Birmingham, centre of Manchester, even the centre of Glasgow, Peter, despite your experiences when you were there, you see there are a lot of people on the streets, and there are a lot of outlets that are trading and doing quite well. Now, they might not all do traditional retail, because clearly online retail is eaten into a degree of sort of the comparison good market. But we have seen a bit of a shift there, particularly into, say, food, drink, other sort of experience type activities. That ultimately what we see is that there are a lot of people walking past the doors. Private entrepreneur goes, oh, do you know what? There's a lot of pockets walking past my door here with pounds in them. Let's sell them something. Now, it might not be fridge freezers anymore. It might be, expensive lattes. But we see that actually in those places where there's strong demand there, you see that sort of the high street continues to be vibrant, it just adjusts. Now, the key reason for that we see why successful high streets do well is because they've got successful city centre economies. Now, what that means is they've got a lot of jobs in them, a lot of high-paid jobs in office-based type industries that are pulling tens of thousands of people in a day, or hundreds of thousands of people in a day in Manchester's case, or in London's case, it's actually over 2 million people sort of cramming into the centre of London. That's a lot of pockets with a lot of pound coins, or a lot of pieces of plastic that are in them to then go and buy things in sort of the local high street businesses that are there. And so it's this element of strong city centre economies then has an impact on the performance of the high street. And if you then say, look at a place like Brighton compared to a place like Doncaster, Brighton has a very, very strong city centre economy, and therefore its high street does well. Doncaster has quite a weak city centre economy with not many jobs in it, and therefore it struggles. Now, the second point I'd like to make is that COVID has completely turned this all on its head. So we've got a high street recoveries tracker on our website for the 63 city centres that we look at. It's freely available to go and have a play with. Please do go and do it after this call. It's a fascinating tool. And what we've seen there is that those weak places that went into the recession in quite a weak position, saw a fallback in terms of footfall, but actually have bounced back. Now, they're bouncing back to quite a weak position, but they have bounced back and recovered the footfall that they lost. So the businesses that were there in February that weren't taking a great deal of money, but clearly were having sort of the bottom line was in black rather than red. They've recovered all of those customers, and that puts them in a relatively good position to continue to trade, notwithstanding obviously lockdown affecting Christmas. But that's quite good news for those weaker places. But in stronger places, what had really been sort of a boom for them, which was all these workers that were coming in on a daily basis, has now become a real hamstring or real Achilles heel for them. In that, because those workers can work from home and haven't returned back yet, we then haven't seen an increase in footfall in those places. And so actually the high streets of those previously very vibrant places are now the ones that are really in a very vulnerable position because they just haven't had their custom come back. So if you look at the figures for central London in particular, it's almost as if central London never left the first lockdown in terms of the number of people who are walking past. Whereas if you look at the figures, say for Birkenhead or Blackpool, it's the opposite. The people went back in their droves and very much back to pre-pandemic levels. So then the third point is, well, is this here to stay? Are we seeing that the weaker places have bounced back, but they're weak? The stronger places were in a good place, but actually they're now in a really bad place. So actually this has just made things ever worse for retail in total. Well, actually, I'll be much more positive than that. Now, while I'm sure we're all really enjoying the work from home experience, and I'm sure that anybody who says that they're really loving it definitely doesn't have young children, because my experience is that it hasn't been so fantastic because of that. I think we will see people going back to the office. And the reason for that is because the real benefit to have face-to-face interaction. So while I'm sure you're really enjoying watching me sort of talk to you through your computer screens, I can guarantee you that would be even better, if we were in a room together. And I look forward that perhaps in the months and years to come, we'll actually be able to do that again. But it's that value of face-to-face interaction that is so important. And that's the reason why we haven't seen a decline in populations in cities in the Far East, which have been challenged by pandemics at least epidemics for the last 20 years. And it's why we've seen an increasing clustering of jobs in the centre of London and centre of Manchester and centre of Birmingham over the last 20 years, despite it being a really expensive place to go and do business. It's because businesses are willing to pay a premium for that face-to-face interaction. Now, I don't think COVID fundamentally changes that. People might now start to work, say, 3 days a week in the office or 4 days a week in the office, but they'll still come into the office. And if they still come into the office, that's still creating a market for those private entrepreneurs to sell them something in shops, bars, restaurants, etc. When that will be, it's not clear. The vaccine news the last couple of days suggests it may be a little bit sooner than originally hoped, but I do think that we will see that return and those strong places will do well again.
Right, having got myself unmuted rather slowly. Thank you very much, Paul, for that upbeat view of the high street and the bounce back. And indeed, I think we're all looking forward to be able to get together face to face to have this sort of discussion, preferably over a pint. Now then, our second panelist today, who's about to make his introduction, is Josef, known as Joe Cannon. And Joe's a barrister at Cornerstone Barristers in London. He has a public law practice split between planning and licensing and is a hospitality entrepreneur. He is the owner and managing director of Federation Coffee, which has 2 premises in South London, the main one being a busy cafe in Brixton Village Market. He co-founded a British charcuterie business and set up a successful restaurant salon also in Brixton. He is a keen enthusiast for the varied delights of the high street. Now, I'm reliably informed that our barista was born in Granada in Spain after his parents ran away together. Well, I can only assume they must have been drawn by the smell of good coffee. Okay, Joe, over to you for your thoughts on the high street in the 21st century.
Thank you. One of the parents is behind me. I often get comments on the picture of my late father. He's been gone many years, but that was the father. My mother is still going strong. And up in Norfolk. But yeah, I don't think in 1976 when they ran away to Granada, I don't think the coffee was particularly good in southern Spain back then. I think they'll find that it's better in Brixton now, but I would say that, wouldn't I? As Peter says, my professional practice, I'm a full-time barrister. My professional practice brings me into contact with the high street quite a lot. I act in my licensing guise, I act for the owners of nightclubs, pubs, cafes, that kind of thing, and also for the local authorities to regulate them. And then in the planning world, obviously, there is a great deal of interaction with the health of the high street and so on. So I do have an interest professionally, but also as the owner of a business which is in effect on the high street, albeit that it's in a covered market in Brixton. I'm sort of seeing it from the other side too. So what I thought I would talk about for the next 5 or 10 minutes is a few sort of vaguely lawyerish points about the way the high street might be changing due to some changes in the legislation, and then a couple of points from the point of view of a cafe owner, basically. The first point I want to raise is one that I know is in a lot of your minds already, certainly from the discussion that we had in our breakout room this morning. That's clear, which is the changes to the use classes order, which effectively regulates or tries to regulate changes between various uses of premises. And on the 1st of September, there was what I think is a very radical change to that use classes order, which is the introduction of a new class E, which means basically it's no longer development. You no longer need planning permission to change from or between offices, shops, restaurants, light industry, medical services, a huge range of things that previously you'd need planning permission to shift between, you no longer need planning permission for. And the main implication of that is that local authorities have, at a stroke, lost control of what, I mean, amongst other things, high street businesses can change to. So whereas previously there are policies about retaining high street uses in particular places, certain buildings can only be A3, whatever, cafes, restaurants, whatever you like. Now they can change and there's no control on local authorities anymore. It's much too soon to know the effect of that yet. I think COVID has, in effect, delayed the market's response to that. But I think it's an opportunity for those who own and operate businesses in the high street to think about what their asset, whether it's the business or the building in which the business is run, might offer now that there's that deregulation. My suspicion is that once the sort of chilling effect of COVID, where everybody's a bit wary about investment decisions or making radical changes, once that wears off, perhaps in the next 6 months to a year, I think there will be quite a big move by those operating businesses and owning property on the high street to try and take advantage of the new freedoms. And it'll be very interesting to see how that comes out. The second point I want to raise, which is really about COVID and to some extent picking up from what Paul said, it strikes me that one of the things that COVID has made us all look at is what we've lost by being locked down. I don't want to quote Joni Mitchell, but sometimes it's not until you lose it that you misquote Joni Mitchell. Not until you've lost something that you realise the value of it. And I think we're all thinking, well, lots of things we took for granted, the ability to go for that pint that Peter was talking about, the ability to just wander down the high street and do some shopping without any particular purpose. They've taken on a new value now that we can't do them. And it'll be really interesting to see again as the COVID effect wears off, whether that new value that we realise it results in a greater use of those facilities. I don't know whether that's true, but I kind of hope so. Again, as the owner of a coffee shop, I know that I have felt, and as a keen consumer of coffee, I have felt that it's very difficult not to be able to just go and sit in a cafe in the last month and have a coffee, having to buy it, take it away, go outside. I've really missed that. So I hope that that will lead people to value those experiences a bit more. And then the third point is a slightly depressing point, which is that, and it's related to my first point, which is that one of the things that may come from the relaxation of the use classes order and the new Class E is an ability, or it will become easier for out of town premises to change into traditional town centre type uses. At the moment, that's quite hard, or at least it was before the 1st of September, because of having to fulfil what's called the sequential test and so on. There was basically a protectionist approach to out of town facilities. And I wonder whether the system, in that now developers can say, well, please could we have this use out of town, which they will get, to then change it to a town centre use will be much easier because of Class E. And I think there is a challenge for the high street to find a new way of retaining its value in the towns. I think the era of planning policy being able to protect town centre uses is, if not over, it's certainly looking like it's under threat. So I think there is a real issue for the high street to think about the particular offer that it can make, the value that it adds to people's experiences, and to sell itself on those things. So those are my sort of technically legalish points. And then, well, what about being a cafe owner? Well, just an anecdote really about owning a business in London. So we have two premises, one in Brixton Market, which is kind of high street in all but name, and the other one is on a commuter railway station, Loughborough Junction, and both of them closed in the lockdown, but the Brixton cafe opened again in June as soon as we could, and actually we've done okay. Peter said it was a busy cafe in Brixton. It's less busy than it was before March, but it's still busy enough to keep us going, and with a combination of government help and some fairly ruthless staffing decisions and so on, we've managed to stay afloat. The Loughborough Junction outlet has been closed since March, and there's just no chance of it opening at all. The footfall on the commuter station is completely dead. And what that makes me think, and the reason I raise it, is that there's an opportunity for, London is quite a specific city, and again, just reflecting on what Paul said about it, there's an opportunity for businesses and high streets that are not in central London to take advantage of the new working from home, sometimes working from home, maybe even working fewer than 5 days a week world, which I think is here to stay. The new, the non-central high streets have an opportunity to pick up some of those pound coins that Paul was talking about, which previously were being spent in central London. But the commuter experience is completely changed. And again, interesting to hear people in my breakout session talk about use of the tube and of metropolitan transport services. What used to be an absolute surefire place to run a business, which was a railway station, particularly if you're selling coffee or something like that, I think that's no longer clear. And I think the idea that the old patterns of people living in dormitory parts of London and getting the train in and that particular route, I think that's really under question now. Whereas, you know, a year ago, I wouldn't have dreamed of saying that our commuter railway station kiosk would be under threat from lack of footfall. You know, it was almost, there was more footfall than we can cope with. So I think post-COVID, my own view is that those patterns of movement will change. I think they're not necessarily set in stone, but I think they will change. And I think there's a real opportunity for high street businesses to think about how they can adapt to people's new patterns of movement and of working in order to ensure that the high street does have a future. I mean, obviously, for various reasons, I hope it does. But perhaps my message is slightly less positive than Paul's, but I think there are lots of challenges, but I think there is a way through it too. And it was really interesting to hear people in my breakout room talk about the opportunities that the high street has. Just before I stop, I just want to reflect on one point that one of my breakout room people, Derek from Reading University, made, which was the particular thing about the high street that is an activity and an experience. So we can all sit at home and click and buy stuff from Amazon or Etsy or whatever else. But in doing that, we're missing out on an experience that we get from going to the high street. And I think the high street, from the other side of the lens, has to think about what experience it offers and has to really emphasize that. If that means cafes in bookshops, which we already see, if that means ways in which to make the experience more pleasant for people, then I think that's the key to the high street surviving and thriving.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Joe, and pleased to hear that you're keeping your head above water, albeit pressurized water in an espresso machine. Now then, our third speaker is coming to us from a considerable distance because Roger Dring, as you've already heard, is in Sydney in Australia. Roger is a strategist with a focus on the future built environment and its alignment with humanity. So no small challenge there. He works with customers to help inform the way that Lend-Lease responds to the future of living, leisure and work. It's 9:45 coming up in Sydney in Australia. And Roger is sitting there, is drawing his international and I'm sorry, I mucked that up. I'll start that again. Based in Sydney, Roger draws on his international and cross-industry experience in property technology, design and financial systems to understand complex systems. Finding and developing innovative solutions or new products that support sustainability and human performance is a key driver. Current projects are centered around the future of work and ways of working initiatives like the local office, a high street-based corporate co-working concept, and other flexible workspaces aimed at supporting the future workforces of large corporations, while the evolution of innovation districts helps to inform the future of education and research with technology or medical advancement. Now, I should point out that it's come to my attention that Roger, some time ago, visited St. Helena. I'm sure you're all aware that that's the famous place of exile and death of Napoleon Bonaparte. Anyway, having visited this tiny, remote volcanic outpost right in the middle of the South Atlantic, I'm rather surprised to find that it's not yet made it to the top of Lend-Lease's development program. Anyway, perhaps you can explain why, Roger. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, I can explain why we haven't developed over there. It's an impossible place to get there. I visited there many years ago on a sailing voyage across the Atlantic, which was quite an adventure, but it's definitely not in Lend-Lease's short list of target development areas. So, well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for having me this morning. I appreciate that it's a busy morning for everybody. And I think the discussion about the high street is fascinating for all of us. The high street represents the heart of a community. It's the local pub. And it's what a major influence in where people choose to live in the world. And it's a really important thing to look at right now in this current climate and understand why and how we can improve that going forward. So this morning, I'd like to talk about three main topics. So it's really about the impact of COVID. And we heard from both Paul and the others with regard to some of the immediate impacts and the pain that people have been suffering and how that's materialized around the world. The other element I'd like to talk about is community, culture, and humanity. And I think that's the underlying thing that we've all seen as a positive out of COVID, is bringing out what people's real humanity is. And Joe just touched on it right there about what do we actually want to have in our communities and what drives us to be able to make the choices and where do we want to be to enjoy that. And the third thing I was going to talk about, as Peter introduced, is about the future of work and the future of workplace and how we might be able to thread that into supporting those previous two topics and building a new future. So as the cloud of COVID kind of lists, I think we'll all find ourselves on the edge of a number of huge changes. From Australia, I'd like to say we escaped COVID very lightly. And despite its brutal impact around the world and the suffering and unparalleled disruption it caused, we're starting to see the re-emergence of returning to work and reopening all of our major workplaces and how that's starting to reintroduce vibrancy back into our places. And I'm pretty sure it won't be long, Joe, before there will be commuters coming back on the trains and your cafe will be successful again. And it's just a case of how and when people do that and how that works. So some of the key questions that we're looking at, trying to take a futurist view, and I'm sure many of you are considering the same things, is how might our communities function in the future? What does work and workplace really look like if we're going to paint a new picture of how our future economies work? Would we really want to commute in rush hour again? And how can we do a better job of looking after each other and our planet? So the world is adapting, as we all know. It's taken a brutal hit, and it's going to be a little awkward for a while. But what it means is it puts us into an era of experimentation. And it's pretty much our job to work out what we're going to do out of those things. So I think I'm pretty safe ground on saying that the future of High Street is in our hands. I think there is a future and there is an opportunity for us to really look at why we want to change things and what we want to gain out of those. And I think I'm in pretty safe ground suggesting that the answer is probably not the last remaining greasy spoon, the dollar store, and a couple of mothballed charity shops as the only city centre, as the only high street activity. And touching on Paul's comments, this isn't focused around city centre high streets. I think there's absolutely a future for city centre, and I'm looking forward to that coming back to life in all of its vibrancy. And it might change a little bit, but I think what's more important is our more local town and village high streets. Those are the places where many people actually live. And what we're seeing is a change and a shift in how those demographics work. And what's really important is that there's an opportunity to rebuild those things. Having mentioned the greasy spoon, as a proud Englishman and an Australian, I do miss a full English and a couple of builders, but that's a different conversation. So if we zoom out a little bit and look at high street and look at what that might mean out of the city centre, Joe touched on it also, that the key things are relating to the people, the place, and the purpose. Purpose is the key thing to anything working effectively. And it's our responsibility as city planners and developers and coordinators to understand what the requirements are of our communities and how we should build places that serve the best culture, humanity, and outcomes that attract people to the local pub and be in their community and understand why they live where they live. Place is an essential element. You'll all be very familiar with the impact of placemaking and to create a location that's desirable where people actually want to be. They need to be safe and healthy and inclusive, fun and vibrant. And those are all the things that people strive for and know when that exists. And the people element is something that's really important to reconsider now. And I'll touch on that when we look at the future of work. The people element is about the residents, the workers, the visitors, and the community that that creates. And what is the definition of community and what should it be? So one of my specialist areas is around the future of work and workplace. And approximately 2 years ago, we were hypothesizing around what the future of work would be. What that leads to is, where does the future of talent come from? And what were their expectations? What's the future employer of choice look like? And what would they want? And also, what do we really want if we were going to stop the music and say, you can change your things? And we touched on it earlier, and I think everybody's now increasingly familiar with the hypothesis we came to a couple of years ago, is that people want to be in the city 2 to 3 days a week. They need to have team and culture and collaboration and customer and all those things that you do in your corporate office. And they're excellent for that, and that's irreplaceable. What was missing in many of those offices is around places to actually focus and do some real detailed individual work. What we were looking at is a local type office. And I'll talk about the local office as a concept, but it's really a work club. It's a cool environment, it's on the high street, and it's a co-working space, and it was designed for corporates. And then to have 1 or 2 days at home to be able to do your laundry and all your other chores and admin that people need to be able to do. And as you say, depending on your home environment, that may or may not be conducive to your work. What it boiled down to, the future of work is about flexibility, it's about autonomy. And the things that now seem really basic are really what we spend some time really unpacking. The technology has now moved on to fully enable these things, hence the reason we're chatting around the world on conference calls. And we've seen, despite the fact there's a lack of human interaction, we have significantly more effective and efficient meetings. They start on time, they're very poignant, people know how to behave and understand that there's a key and allocated time on that. So what we've been looking at is, if we broke down the workplace into a workplace ecosystem, what would that look like? And if you weren't just limited to having 2 types, one is the city office and one is working from home, what about having a local office, somewhere close to home, but allows you a commercially responsible place where you feel empowered and effective? And if you could spend 20 to 30% of your time there, that effectively puts 20% of your white collar city time back into the community. And with that time goes money, and with that money goes the participation in being part of the community. We think these are excellent sort of attitudes to be able to strive towards. And we created our project here in Manly that allows us to be able to have a high street presence for corporate co-workers. So that brings major corporate people back into their community. It's healthy. It enables active commuting. It's very productive, it's calm, it's quiet, and it's purposeful. And people usually respond to saying, I got almost twice, if not 3 times the amount of work time I did in half the time. So we're really moving from a 4-dimensional workspace where it was time and location, 9 to 5 in the office, into almost a 4-dimensional workspace, which is time is flexible now, and many people work in all kinds of times. Locations can be distributed in many different places, and we touched on those two or three different types that we had. We're also very much looking at the type of work that you do and where you do it, and that creates a dimension that's different for almost every individual depending on the role that they have. And then the 4th dimension is really the team dynamic, and how does that all fit together? And so it's becoming a really interesting philosophy, and we're working through with a number of our companies to explore what that looks like. And it becomes in those 4 layers of hub, city hub for culture, for brand, for collaboration, for a club, which is a place for where aspirationally where people want to be in community and in part of the ecosystem they want to support. And then at home, and providing healthy, safe working places at home, and an underlying technology that interfaces all those things together. So I think if we look at our questions of what we want our future to look like, putting people back into community and understanding how to really add purpose to what the high street should be, create an infrastructure to support that, means that there's a really positive opportunity to adjust the way humanity evolves. And I think it's our job right now to be able to discuss that and understand how we can each contribute to putting the people back where they want to be and create the great places. So I'll hand back to you, Peter, but thanks so much for the time to chat today.
Roger, thanks very much for that contribution. I'm reminded with your mention of your project in Manly that the ferries that ply across or along the Sydney Harbour between Central Quay and Manly are symmetrical vessels with a bow on each end. Apparently it saves them time not having to turn round at each ferry terminal, but it does mean that the people in Manly really don't know whether they're coming or going. Sorry, I picked that up in a Sydney bar and I haven't been able to get rid of it before, so I knew it would come in useful one day.
It's very true.
Let's open up the discussion amongst the panelists now, and a number of the points that you've raised have been picked up on the chat from various people that are participating today, and there are a number of common threads coming out. The first one is I'd like to pick up something with Joe. You talked about the new use class, Class E, which I think most people would see in the current situation as being incredibly useful if we are going to move forward to a much more mixed use high street with greater flexibility to come and go between various uses, provided they're uses that add to the vibrancy and the economy of the central place. But I'm also interested in another legislative change, and that's the extension of the permitted development scheme to allow conversion of what the government call empty, but nobody's to say how you make it empty shop units into residential. And I have this awful vision of these former shop units with grills over the windows and doors, now serving as residential units in previous shopping streets, and the dynamic that could have. Are you seeing much use of this approach yet? And are you hearing of issues that it's raising?
I think that's a really good point to raise. The answer, the basic answer is not yet. I haven't heard of a great deal of that being taken up, but by analogy, it reminds me that one of the issues that planners have seen in town and city centres over the last few years is what I think basically the disastrous permitted development capability to go from office to residential, which has led to a series of totally unsuitable buildings being converted to residential use. Mainly, I'm talking about kind of soundproof and so on. The absence of a need for planning permission has meant that that's been possible to convert buildings which just aren't suitable for flats into flats, often cheek by jowl with noise creating premises like licensed premises, bars, clubs, and so on. And that's been a real problem. And of course, it's all driven by land values associated with residential. you can, generally speaking, make more money from flats in the town centre than you can from offices. Now, I agree with you. What does empty mean? There's a sort of related issue in the world, which is the change of use of pubs to residential, and what goes with that is a kind of a campaign of trying to prove that the pub isn't viable anymore, which is often subject to all kinds of jiggery-pokery. In fact, I'm involved in a case at the moment where a pretty shady attempt at showing the pub, or to me it looks shady, showing that the pub is no longer viable, has resulted in it being very difficult to resist the change. If you can say, well, we can't make this business run, therefore please can we have a house in this rather fine listed public house that's been a pub for hundreds of years, well, I think that's problematic. So I think there's probably a whole mini industry of showing that the building concern has come to the end of its use. And as you say, one of the things about residential development, obviously it's a really essential part, I think, of a vibrant mixed use town or city centre. But I think if there's too much of it, it can kill the vibrancy of a town or city centre. You talk about sort of active frontages and so on. The entrance to a block of flats is not active, and it actually has the opposite effect. And it can deaden a town centre. So I think there is a problem. Now, of course, all of this liberalisation of the planning rules, use classes, order, permitted development, so on, what we really mean when we say they're being liberalised is a removal of control, the removal of an ability to stop them or control them or impose conditions on those changes. So I do think it's a problem. And I think the local authority world is going to have to come up with ways to, if not control, but certainly influence the changes that are now permitted under the newly liberalised regime. So I think that's another real issue for the high street. And again, I hope the answer comes from those that run businesses, own property and so on the high street, and can come up with their own framework for protecting the vibrancy of the high street in the face of sometimes the threat, if you like, from a change to residential.
Well, thanks, Joe. I mean, putting my planner hat back on and, parking my academic hat just for the moment, it does remind me that as the planning system is increasingly weakened or decreased in its influence by central government, who are mindful of developers' complaints that planning delays development, so it's becoming much more important for developers themselves to be the curators of place. If we aren't going to be allowed to advise and do it and control to achieve it, then it has to be those in the development companies who attract the talent that will have the ideas for good placemaking. And I'm very pleased to see the way that development companies are picking up the postgraduates we're turning out at the Bartlett from planning school. And increasingly, I'm hearing from the top people in the development world that they're no longer looking to the traditional real estate schools for their new recruits. They want people that can think more laterally. They want people that can think more in the round about placemaking and adding value, rather than simply people who can do evaluation.
Yeah.
So I think that may be a trend that's developing. Joe, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just a thought about that change. I mean, the traditional model, if you like, is of planners, local authority planners being there to control and often to say no, and the developers being there to ask and be told no. Whereas I think what needs to develop is a new conversation. I think you're right that the development industry, in general terms, needs to step up and become the curators because the local authorities have lost control. But I don't think that necessarily needs to be a binary thing. I think what there ought to be is a new conversation, a new partnership actually between local authorities who ought to be able to continue to influence spaces and places, but without the kind of veto that maybe they had 2 years ago. So I'm hopeful that with the things that you say about new graduates going to that world and so on, that there might be a new way of conversing, which is a bit less confrontational and a bit less yes or no, and perhaps more collaborative around what places ought to look like, and that coming out not of a relationship of yes and no, control, no, you can't do that, but one of bottom-up ideas which are then embraced and put forward. Now that might be a bit over-optimistic, but I think we all need a bit of over-optimism, don't we, at the moment?
Well, I always used to say to potential developers in the city, do please come to see me at the back of the envelope stage, but please make sure your architect hasn't drawn on the envelope first. You know, if the planner and the architect and the developer can sit down together, then the planner can provide the community or neighborhood brief, the developer can provide the development brief, and then the architect can take the two and make the best out of them. Anyway, that's getting a bit back into my old, putting my planning hat back on again. I'd like to turn to Paul now. Sorry, yes, please.
I was just commenting on that. So I think Joe's exactly right. I think that's the key to a lot of urbanization now, is to take a scale view. And it's not about individual building and development rights and things like that. It's around how do you create district and place, and how do you convene best and highest use, not just for a single building, but for a precinct or a community. And I think it's the responsibility of council and government to help coordinate and open the door to be able to have those discussions. And I think opening the conversation says that there should be competition in the world to understand how everybody wins a bit, and understanding that it takes big and small, fast and slow to make it interesting. You need the big guys, you need the residential to be able to fund the less lucrative aspects, but you also need to understand the value and respect of culture, and the importance of sustainability, and the importance of doing the right thing and being the organization and or the community that you want to be standing for. And I think it takes a brave council to be able to do that, but there is space to look at public-private partnership and understand how the framework can be set up to set up some more effective governance. And I think now's the time to have those conversations. And especially as the demise of High Street, as we've been seeing around the world, it is at risk. Is it the time to just let it go? And what's a better plan? And the better plan is, let's sit down and talk about it together and carve out a space for everybody to have a piece of the pie.
I mean, that's very good, Roger, but I think you do have to bear in mind that things are rather different over here in old Europe, or at least in old UK. In Australia and Sydney and the great cities in Australia, planners are still allowed to plan, and politicians still believe in the importance of planning. I'm afraid that's no longer the case in the UK, where governments from Tony Blair's onwards have taken great delight in decimating the planning system. We have nothing to do now other than to hope to influence. But that doesn't mean to say we should give up. As I say, I think we should be hoping to influence, and we should be better educating the development sector to fill some of the gap that the government has created. I'm sorry?
Maybe that's your post-Brexit opportunity right there. Now the politicians have got nothing else to worry about in Europe.
Well, yes, but I get the impression that post-Brexit, the politicians are going to want to tear up even more. They're wanting to show how gung-ho we are. But anyway, please leave Brexit to one side for today. I don't think we've got time to cover that one, but thank you for the suggestion. I'd like to shift the discussion slightly by going to Paul and putting to him a suggestion, which in fact Roger was making, about the importance of the neighbourhood office. Now, Paul was very upbeat about the future of retail, future for retail, although I see one of our contributors has already said that you can only have just so many coffee shops. Sorry about that, Joe, but only the best ones, obviously. But this idea of the neighbourhood office and bringing in other uses to the high street, do you think that would perhaps strengthen the economy and actually help to support the remaining shops? Paul?
So if that means neighbourhood office in terms of this idea of local hubs, so you wouldn't go into your central London office, but there would be some hub locally. I mean, this is an idea that a lot of people have spoken about. You could argue to some extent that you do have some of those sorts of things already, and there's a bit of a market for it. So, companies like Rees do have different bases around London. And indeed, I went to visit physiotherapists in one in New Southgate only a couple of weeks ago. But I don't think we'll see a whole-scale change in that. And the reason for this is we've got to think about, well, why is it that people want, or well, maybe it's not people, but companies want to have people within one place? What is the point of trying to bring people together? Well, it's about trying to bring your colleagues together to exchange ideas and information. Now, if it's the case that actually, part of your team is in a hub in South London, another part of your team is in South East London, another part of your team is in North London, you're not really getting those benefits of bringing the people together. So from the organisation's perspective, it doesn't seem to me that those neighbourhood hubs really work. And actually, you'll be just as well having sort of that person based in their kitchen or their back bedroom as you would be having them then in that local hub. It's the element about bringing them together. Now, if on the other hand, you're a freelancer and you don't want to be working in your kitchen on your own, you want to have a bit of variation, then yes, a local hub may work. Or yes, the coffee shop might work, but they've been doing that already. And so if we're thinking about whole scale change and about large employers, I don't really see how that arrangement especially works for them. Now, of course, I may well be wrong, but certainly from trying to think about this logically, I just don't really see how that follows through to any large extent.
Yes, I think what was being suggested was that not that you replace the city centre office where you have the big creative get-togethers and the meetings, but somewhere where people could go to work, do the sort of work which is assumed they will do at home. After all, I'm very much aware that a lot of the 20 and 30 somethings working in the city don't have homes as we understand them. They may be staying with friends or still living with parents. This concept that we can all work from home, I can assure you that my students are less frightened of COVID than they are about having to live another year with their parents. They want to get back to the university or back to the workplace. They're just gagging for it. So I'm sure that the central office districts are going to bounce back. The city survived the Black Death in the 14th century when half the population died, bounced back even stronger, did the same after the Great Fire of London, even stronger. I'm sure places like the City of London are going to bounce back stronger. One of our audience has raised the question of the 20-minute city. Now, we're all aware of big cities and perhaps taking up to an hour to travel between one part of a city and another and allowing for an hour to do that. Let's go back to the Australian experience, and distances, of course, tend to be much greater. People rely perhaps more on car-borne transport. What about this concept of the 20-minute city? Any thoughts on that, Roger?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the concept of 20-minute city and walkability and all the things that that create convenience are what drive a neighborhood. And you have a 20-minute sort of periphery around any kind of central place where there is. And so looking at the experience we're looking at with the community space, and to touch on one of Paul's comments, like I'll come back to kind of why it may be working, and it may be in certain circumstances, but the 20-minute city is really where people have really connected back to community. And so 20-minute city from home, and to say, if I can get wherever I need to be within my living city, and to be able to do that in a healthy, safe, connected way, and it feels authentic to where it is, and it's vibrant and active, then the desire to get out of that, or the need to get out of that, is significantly reduced. And I think that's the essence of how communities work. And so looking at a 20-minute radius, depending on how you measure that and what you need to be able to include in that, gives you some parameters of how do you address those needs. And I mentioned earlier about the three things around people, place, and purpose. So what's the purpose of the place that we're calling a 20-minute city? It's to be able to provide all the function, activity, access, and community benefit that goes with that. And so to functionally put those together and make it safe and walkable and accessible is effectively going back to kind of human principles of, avoiding the car commute, avoiding all of the things that we've created in our modern world that we're kind of frankly unpicking. And what we're finding about things like retail, and there's obviously some massive shifts with retail that we've seen over the last couple of years, that the retail experience is the bit that still exists. People want to touch things, try things, see things, feel things, and be part of that as a physical, tactile experience. The actual shopping and execution and carrying stuff around, of course, get somebody to deliver that, that's it. But it's that human connection and the experience in the tactile world that's essential to those. And just to touch on your point around why people go to the city, part of that is that vibrancy. And it's about making sure that you've got connection with your people and your teams and your things, and to be able to go out and enjoy the culture of the place that is the city, which is traditionally much more vibrant and diverse and all the rest of it. But what we found with our experiment over the last year and a half with our community-based offices is that most people are done with the city and hanging out with their colleagues and collaborating. And whilst they all see it as essential and critical, most people have enough collaboration and enough of those things within 2 to 3 days. And then the majority of people just need to get some work done. I just need to think about it. I don't need to collaborate. I don't need to see you. I need someone to actually focus and be purposeful. And that's really the difference, is that you're separating the why people need to be there with that particular location. And if you can connect that within a 20-minute city, I think you end up with a really kind of valuable proposition for what the future of community should look like.
Thanks very much, Roger. That's great. Now, before summing up, because I'm aware that time is pressing on, I'm just going to go back to first Joe and then Paul to see if you've got any short final thought that you'd like to send people away with into the breakout rooms for the final part of the session. So Joe first.
Well, thanks. I think the thought that seems to be recurring, which is really going on between what Paul and Roger are both talking about, is a new focus on what we really want and need from the post-COVID world. What is it that we do these things for? You know, a year ago, we took those things for granted. An example is Paul saying, and I think he's right, that actually there's a real value in getting together and being together with your teams. Roger's point, which is that you don't need to do that 5 days a week. You know, maybe we don't need to do any of the things that we used to do 5 days a week anymore. So I think we all need to be much better at thinking about what we really want. And in this new world, you know, what are the things that are essential and what are the things that are non-essential and were only there because they were there. So I think that's what I would like people to think about.
Excellent. And Paul, your final thought.
I think I was just touch on the permitted development rights point that was raised earlier, and there was a question about residential and impact on that in terms of supporting high street. I think Manchester has seen very large residential growth in its city centre, which no doubt has then supported its high street as a result, because it's become a more attractive place to do business. And what that has meant is that it's pulled in lots of jobs. That's then supported a number of retail, cafes, bars, etc., which has changed the proposition that Manchester city centre makes as a place to live. So that residential demand has risen off the back of the growing sort of importance of Manchester city centre economy, because nobody wanted to live in Manchester city centre in the late 80s, and the leader of Manchester City Council, Richard Lees, makes a joke about that, and then we've seen this huge expansion since. I think on your points, Peter, you know, there's a risk now though with PDR that we're going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg, because if all of a sudden that office space is then going to be converted into residential, and that residential is there because of the office space was there in the first place, that just poses a particular challenge. And if the office space disappears, that changes how attractive the city centre is in terms of a place to live, and then you've got the potential of a downward spiral. So that is a pretty important thing for us to be talking about in terms of how you manage that city centre space.
That's excellent, Paul. Thank you for that. And in fact, that chimes in with a question that was directed at me through the chat line about if offices are going to shrink and people are going to require less office space, why isn't the city keen to have more residential within the City of London? And as I sort of touched on slightly earlier, we have to bear in mind that residential space is worth 8 to 10 times what office space is worth in centre of London and indeed many other cities. So if you take the brakes off on allowing conversion to residential in city centres, then you're going to lose your office accommodation, which is what we've seen happening in places like Reading and Brighton and various other smaller cities around the country under the government's deregulated system. So I am a great believer in mixed use. But mixed use doesn't necessarily have to include residential, or at least not a great amount of it. I mean, I should explain, I'm a little bit of a hypocrite. I'm sitting on the 27th floor of an apartment building in the City of London. So I am a city resident, but it's on the fringe of the city next to the Barbican, which is our concentration of residents within the square mile. But the way that you can achieve vibrancy in the downtown, if I can call it that, or the central business district, is by combining business and leisure. Residents don't want noisy and vibrant leisure activity right next to where they live, waking up their babies in the late hours. So you can bring the leisure downtown and bring the bars and those activities into where the central business district is without disturbing anybody. And in fact, their primary customers are the people who are working by day in those central business districts. One of the things I'm proudest of is when I arrived as city planner in 1985, all the pubs used to close at 8:30 in the evening and people went back to the suburbs, went home to the suburbs for their leisure. Now we have bars, or at least we did until the current lockdown was just ended. We have bars open until 4 in the morning, and Thursday night in the city is party night. So I see the opportunity of increasing the vibrancy of business districts by this new creation of a life which is work and leisure combined. We saw this in Shoreditch to the north of the city over the last couple of decades. Young people starting up their own businesses, having lost jobs at the end of the banking crash, started up businesses in the places where they like to play, in Shoreditch, where the nightlife was. And now that kind of development has been pushed out of Shoreditch by gentrification and investment residential property and has moved into the city itself. WeWork are the largest single occupiers of floor space in the City of London. And that, I think, is great hope for the future, because although we may need less quantity of floor space for each business, although we may need it for less of the time, we do all want to be where the activity is. On a Thursday evening, I can go out and the city's been dead during the day, nobody's come to work, but the pubs and the bars are vibrant because the youngsters who work in the city come in on a Thursday evening to meet all their mates and to network and to seek out better jobs, even though they're not actually still coming to the office. That gives me hope for the future of the centres like the City of London. Anyway, I've talked enough. We've had some great contributions from the panelists, and I'd like to thank Paul and Roger and Joe for their contributions. I'd also like to thank the audience members who've contributed via the chat line. I hope I've been able to pick up most of your points, but if not, now's the time to develop those, because I'm going to send you back to the networking rooms. We have the question that you're going to answer, which I believe was put to you for the poll before, and we're putting it to you again at the end, because we want to see if we've in any way changed your opinions on the future of the British High Street. But in going back into your breakout rooms, you'll have a chance to do a little bit more networking and also develop some of the things we've talked about today. Can I thank you all for joining us today, and hope that we've all collectively moved forward the debate on the high streets, which is so topical in this week of retail close downs. Thank you all very much.